On the morning the sky over Millbrook Airfield turned the color of steel, a woman named Grace Harrison stood in front of a machine worth $180 million and laughed at a man in work boots. She did not know yet that within 10 minutes, that laugh would become the most expensive sound of her career. She did not know that the man she mocked in front of dozens of engineers, investors, and reporters had once spent his life pulling apart wreckage to find out why people died in the sky. All she saw was a quiet technician in a stained jacket, telling her that the helicopter behind them should not fly. All she felt was the certainty of a woman who had built an empire and refused to believe anyone beneath her could see something she could not. Helix Dynamics had spent 3 years and hundreds of millions of dollars developing what its marketing materials called the safest experimental helicopter ever built for commercial use. Grace Harrison, 32 years old, had inherited leadership of the company after a boardroom battle that left her the youngest chief executive in the history of American aerospace manufacturing. She was brilliant, and everyone said so. She was also, in the words of one former colleague who no longer worked there, someone who believed doubt was a weakness other people carried. On that particular morning, cameras from 6 news outlets and representatives from 4 major investment firms had gathered on the tarmac to watch the unveiling of the company's newest aircraft, a machine the engineers called simply the Prototype 7. Nobody paid much attention to the man walking the perimeter of the aircraft with a small tablet in his hand. Aaron Brooks was 36 years old, and on paper he was nothing more than a field inspection technician, one of dozens of workers hired to run pre-flight checks before executives arrived. He wore the same Navy jacket every day, spoke only when necessary, and ate lunch alone at a picnic table near the hangar. Nobody at Helix Dynamics knew that before he wore that Navy jacket, Aaron Brooks had spent 11 years leading military aviation accident investigations, the kind of work that meant walking through burned fields and twisted metal to explain to grieving families exactly what had gone wrong. After his discharge, Aaron had quietly withdrawn from that world entirely. He turned down consulting positions from 3 major manufacturers and 2 government contractors, choosing instead the anonymity of hands-on inspection work, the kind of job where nobody asked him about his past because nobody thought to ask. 3 days before the unveiling, while running a routine sensor calibration on the rotor assembly, Aaron noticed something that made him stop cold. A cluster of sensors monitoring blade stress showed readings that were technically within range, but the pattern of those readings matched something he had seen only once before, in the wreckage report of a helicopter that had gone down 8 years earlier, killing everyone aboard. He reported it that same afternoon to the flight safety supervisor, who logged the concern and passed it upward. He reported it again the next day, this time in writing, describing the specific irregularity in the cancellation of certain signal patterns coming from the primary rotor sensors. Nobody responded. The unveiling had already been announced to investors, the press had already been invited, and the words of a field technician carried very little weight against a schedule that had been building for 3 years. Aaron requested one more day to run a full diagnostic. He was told there was no time. He was told more than once that the machine had already passed every certification test required by federal regulators, and that his concerns, while noted, would not delay the event. On the morning of the unveiling, Aaron made one final attempt. He walked directly onto the tarmac, past the roped-off area reserved for staff, and approached the small stage where Grace Harrison was reviewing notes with her communications director. He told her plainly that the aircraft should not fly that day, that something in the rotor sensor array was behaving in a way he had only ever seen precede catastrophic failure, and that he needed at minimum 2 more hours to confirm what he suspected. Grace looked at him the way a person looks at an interruption rather than a warning. She asked him who he was. He told her his title and nothing more. What happened next took less than 90 seconds, but it would be replayed, described, and argued over for years afterward by everyone who witnessed it. Grace Harrison, standing in front of investors, reporters, and dozens of her own engineers, turned to Aaron Brooks with the practiced composure of someone accustomed to being obeyed, and she laughed. It was not a nervous laugh. It was the laugh of someone entirely certain that the man in front of her understood nothing about the machine she had spent 3 years building. She told him, loudly enough for the cameras to catch it clearly, that if this helicopter flew, she would personally clean his boots in front of everyone standing there. A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd of engineers standing nearby, the kind of laughter people offer not because something's funny, but because the person in power has decided it should be. Aaron did not raise his voice. He did not argue, did not explain the technical details that had brought him there, did not try to justify himself in front of a crowd that had already made up its mind about who he was. He simply looked at Grace, and in a voice so calm it barely carried past the first few rows, he told her she had about 10 minutes. Nobody understood what he meant. Grace certainly did not. She turned back to her notes, gave a small nod to her flight operations director, and the countdown to launch began exactly on schedule. The tarmac buzzed with the particular tension that precedes something either historic or disastrous. Reporters adjusted their cameras. Investors checked their watches. The test pilot, a woman named Renee Castillo with over 4,000 hours of flight experience, climbed into the cockpit and ran through her final checklist while ground crew cleared the immediate area. Grace stood near the stage with her arms crossed, still faintly amused by the exchange that had just occurred, already composing in her mind the story she would tell reporters afterward about the technician who had briefly threatened to embarrass the company. The rotor blades began to spin. The engine noise rose from a low hum into a roar that vibrated through the chest of everyone standing close enough to feel it. Exactly 10 minutes and 11 seconds after Aaron Brooks had spoken those words, the entire electronic system of Prototype 7 failed at once. The rotor, which had been spinning at full test speed, began to shudder violently, the kind of shaking that experienced pilots recognize immediately as something no aircraft should ever do. Inside the cockpit, warning lights across the entire control panel turned red within the span of 2 seconds, a cascading failure that flight instructors describe in nightmare scenarios but rarely see in real life. Renee Castillo, following every protocol drilled into her over a decade of flying, immediately called for an emergency shutdown and aborted the launch before the aircraft ever left the ground. The engine cut. The rotor slowed, still trembling with a wrongness that anyone on that tarmac could feel in their bones even if they could not name it. For several seconds, nobody moved. The reporters who had been filming for a triumphant unveiling suddenly found themselves filming something entirely different, and their cameras stayed rolling because instinct told them this mattered more than the story they had come to cover. Grace Harrison stood frozen, her arms still crossed, her mouth slightly open, watching the machine she had promised the world would change commercial aviation sit dead and smoking on the runway in front of every person whose money and credibility depended on it working. Engineers rushed the aircraft, shouting instructions to each other, none of them entirely certain what had caused a failure this total and this sudden. Diagnostic screens flickered with error codes that did not correspond to any single known malfunction, the kind of chaotic data that suggests either a catastrophic systems collapse or something far more deliberate than a simple mechanical fault. In the middle of that chaos, Aaron Brooks walked forward, unhurried, the same navy jacket, the same quiet expression he had worn 10 minutes earlier when nobody believed him. He climbed halfway up the maintenance ladder, looked at the primary control panel for perhaps 4 or 5 seconds, and then stepped back down. He told the lead engineer exactly which sensor cluster had failed, exactly which wiring pathway had triggered the cascading shutdown, and exactly why the failure pattern matched a specific type of manufacturing defect rather than random mechanical wear. He said it plainly, without any satisfaction in his voice, the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis rather than the way a person delivers an insult. The lead engineer, a 20-year veteran named Peter Whitfield, stared at him for a long moment before turning to his own team and repeating the instructions exactly as Aaron had given them. Nobody on that tarmac, including Grace Harrison, had ever heard a field technician speak with that kind of precision before. It took the engineering team nearly 4 hours to open the rotor housing and confirm what Aaron had said within seconds of glancing at a screen. Every detail matched. The sensor cluster he had identified was indeed the point of failure. The wiring pathway he had named was indeed the one that triggered the cascade. Even the specific type of manufacturing defect he described, a flaw that would not have shown up in standard certification testing, was exactly what the disassembled components revealed under closer inspection. Peter Whitfield, standing over the opened housing with grease on his hands, said out loud what several people on that team were already thinking, that no ordinary field technician diagnoses a failure like this from a glance. Grace Harrison, who had spent the last 4 hours giving vague statements to reporters and quietly canceling 3 scheduled investor calls, finally asked someone to pull Aaron Brooks's personnel file. What she found unsettled her more than the failed launch itself. The employment history was thin, deliberately thin, the kind of record that suggested someone had wanted to disappear rather than build a resume. But underneath the sparse civilian work history, a background check that her assistant ran through an outside firm turned up something else entirely, a military service record showing that Aaron Brooks had spent over a decade leading aviation accident investigations for the armed forces, involved in more than 70 separate crash inquiries, credited with several patented innovations in rotor safety systems that were still in use by defense contractors today. Grace read the file twice. She learned that after his discharge, Aaron had been approached by no fewer than 3 major aerospace manufacturers offering him executive-level consulting positions with salaries that would have made him wealthy within a few years. He had turned down every single one. Instead, he had taken anonymous technical jobs, moving quietly between small firms, never staying long enough for anyone to look too closely at who he really was. Nobody in her file could explain why a man with his expertise would choose to spend his days doing entry-level inspection work at a company that did not even know his real qualifications. Grace, for the first time in longer than she could remember, felt something closer to curiosity than certainty. She asked Peter Whitfield privately whether anyone else on the engineering staff had known about Aaron's background, and Peter told her honestly that nobody had, that Aaron had never once mentioned his military record, never once corrected anyone who assumed he was simply a technician with a good eye for detail. That silence struck Grace as strange at first, and then, the longer she thought about it, as something almost admirable. Most people she had worked with over the years wanted credit the moment they were right about anything. Aaron had let an entire company underestimate him for months, without saying a single word to correct their assumption, and he had only stepped forward when silence would have meant letting people fly a machine he knew was dangerous. That curiosity deepened considerably the following day, when Aaron approached her privately, away from cameras and engineers, and told her something that had nothing to do with sensors or wiring at all. He explained that he had not simply stumbled into his position at Helix Dynamics. A former colleague from his military days, now working in aviation supply chain security, had sent him information suggesting that certain components arriving at the company's receiving warehouse did not match the specifications listed on their manufacturing certificates. He had taken the technician job specifically to investigate quietly, without alerting whoever inside the company might be responsible, because the pattern he had been shown suggested something far more dangerous than a simple quality control lapse. According to what Aaron had pieced together before that day, someone with significant authority inside Helix Dynamics had been substituting cheaper, lower-grade sensor components in place of the certified parts the company was billing to its investors and reporting to federal regulators. If those substituted components made it into aircraft sold to commercial buyers, the consequences would not be limited to embarrassment or financial loss. Faulty rotor sensors, the exact kind that had just failed on the tarmac in front of dozens of witnesses, could cause catastrophic failures in aircraft carrying paying passengers, potentially resulting in hundreds of deaths across the company's eventual commercial fleet. Aaron had decided, quietly and without authorization from anyone, to investigate it himself. Grace sat with that information for a long moment before asking the question that mattered most, which was who inside her own company could possibly be responsible for something this serious. Aaron told her he did not know the full extent of it yet, only that the substitutions appeared too consistent and too well documented to be the work of a single low-level employee acting alone. Someone with access to purchasing records, someone with the authority to approve incoming shipments without triggering standard audits, had to be involved. Grace, still shaken from watching her own aircraft nearly kill her test pilot in front of the entire industry, made a decision that surprised even herself. She asked Aaron to help her find out who. Over the following 2 weeks, Grace Harrison and Aaron Brooks began an investigation that neither of them discussed with anyone else inside the company. They started in the receiving warehouse, comparing serial numbers on incoming shipment logs against the certificates filed with federal regulators, a tedious process that required cross-referencing thousands of individual component records. Aaron taught himself the rhythm of Grace's schedule so they could review documents late at night, after the building had emptied, when nobody would notice 2 people going through boxes that were supposed to have been inspected and cleared months earlier. What they found, piece by piece, painted a picture far worse than either of them had initially feared. Dozens of shipments over the past 18 months showed discrepancies between the components listed on certification paperwork and the actual parts physically present in the boxes. Security camera footage from the warehouse loading dock, footage that Grace had to request personally, because it had somehow been excluded from a routine system backup 6 months earlier, showed unmarked delivery trucks arriving during off hours, well outside the standard receiving schedule that every other supplier followed. Cross-referencing purchase order approvals against employee access logs led them to two names that appeared on nearly every questionable transaction: a vice president of engineering named Marcus Webb and a director of procurement named Diane Foster. Grace had trusted both of them completely. Marcus Webb had been with the company for 9 years and had personally overseen the development of Prototype 7 from its earliest design phase. Diane Foster had built the procurement department almost from scratch and was widely regarded as one of the most detail-oriented executives in the entire organization. Neither of them had ever given Grace a reason to doubt their loyalty, which made the mounting evidence all the more difficult for her to accept. Aaron, who had seen this pattern before in other investigations, told her gently that the people closest to a scheme like this were almost always the ones least likely to be suspected, precisely because trust made them invisible. As the evidence accumulated, so did the risk. 3 days after Grace requested the excluded camera footage, an unusual number of warehouse inventory records were quietly deleted from the company's internal server, the kind of digital cleanup that suggested someone inside the organization had noticed the investigation and was scrambling to cover tracks before anyone could connect the pieces together. Aaron recognized the signs immediately and warned Grace that whoever was responsible now knew they were being watched, which meant the two of them were racing against people who had every incentive to destroy evidence before it could be used against them. The quiet, careful pace of their investigation suddenly needed to become something far more urgent. Grace made the decision to set a trap, and she chose the most public and most dangerous stage available to her, a second flight demonstration announced to the press as proof that the earlier failure had been fully corrected. Publicly, she told reporters and investors that engineers had identified and resolved the technical fault behind the aborted launch, and that Prototype 7 would fly successfully within the week. Privately, several members of her own leadership team objected strongly, arguing that scheduling another demonstration so soon after a public failure was reckless and would only compound the damage if something went wrong again. Grace listened to every objection and overruled them all without explaining why. Behind the scenes, Aaron worked through the nights leading up to the second demonstration, quietly replacing the compromised rotor sensors with fully certified components sourced directly and verified through channels that bypassed the normal procurement chain entirely. He installed hidden cameras inside the sensor housing and along the warehouse loading dock, small enough to avoid detection but positioned precisely enough to capture anyone attempting to tamper with the aircraft before its flight. Grace helped him coordinate the timing, ensuring that only a small handful of trusted maintenance staff had access to the hangar during the critical hours before the new demonstration. The two of them said very little to each other during that stretch of nights, but a quiet understanding had begun to form between them, the kind that grows between people relying on each other under pressure. 2 nights before the scheduled flight, the hidden cameras captured exactly what Aaron had predicted they would. Marcus Webb entered the hangar after hours, accompanied by a technician who reported directly to Diane Foster, and the two men opened the rotor housing to swap out the newly certified sensors for a set of substitute components nearly identical in appearance, but manufactured to a far lower and cheaper specification. The footage showed their faces clearly, showed the serial numbers on the parts they removed and the parts they installed, and showed a conversation between them, partially audible, referencing a financial arrangement neither of them wanted documented anywhere official. It was, in every sense, the evidence Aaron had spent weeks trying to obtain, captured cleanly and completely on the very first attempt. Grace watched the footage the following morning in silence, sitting alone in her office long after Aaron had already reviewed it and confirmed every detail matched what they suspected. She understood, watching two men she had once considered essential to her company casually discuss substituting parts that could kill people, that Aaron Brooks had understood the shape of this danger before she had even finished laughing at him on that tarmac. He had known, standing there in his stained jacket while investors and reporters watched, that the failure everyone was about to witness was not a random accident, but the visible symptom of something rotten running underneath the entire company. Grace called an emergency board meeting for that same afternoon. The room was full within the hour, every senior executive summoned without explanation, the kind of gathering that immediately signals something serious is about to happen. Marcus Webb and Diane Foster took their usual seats near the head of the table, apparently unaware of what awaited them, and both offered polished, confident denials the moment Grace raised the subject of component discrepancies in the warehouse. Marcus insisted the substitutions must have been a supplier error, something far outside his direct control. Diane suggested that whoever raised these concerns clearly did not understand the complexities of international parts procurement, and that Grace was chasing shadows based on incomplete information. That was when Aaron Brooks walked into the room, carrying a laptop connected to the main conference screen, and asked permission to show something the board needed to see. Grace nodded and the footage began to play. The room fell silent as Marcus Webb and his associate appeared on screen, opening the rotor housing, swapping certified components for substandard ones, discussing money that should never have changed hands. Aaron followed the video with technical data showing the exact difference in failure tolerance between the certified sensors and the substituted ones, numbers that made it unmistakably clear how close Prototype 7 had come to catastrophic failure during its very first public test. Two independent aviation safety consultants, brought in by Grace earlier that morning without informing anyone on the board, confirmed everything Aaron had presented within minutes of reviewing the raw data themselves. The room that had been full of confident denials only moments earlier fell into a silence so complete that several people later described it as the quietest they had ever heard a boardroom become. Marcus Webb was escorted out of the building before the meeting even ended, and Diane Foster followed less than an hour later, both suspended pending a full internal and federal investigation that would eventually uncover the true scope of what they had done. Regulatory investigators arrived within days, and what they found confirmed that the scheme had touched far more than a single prototype. Grace understood in the days that followed precisely how close Helix Dynamics had come to a disaster that would have ended not just her career but potentially hundreds of lives. Had Prototype 7 succeeded in its first flight and later been sold to commercial operators carrying real passengers, the company would likely have collapsed entirely under the weight of lawsuits, criminal liability, and public outrage once the truth eventually surfaced, as it almost certainly would have. Instead, because one quiet man in a stained jacket had refused to stay silent even after being publicly humiliated, the company had a chance to correct itself before that horror ever became real. Grace carried that realization with her every day for the following weeks, and it changed the way she looked at everyone who worked beneath her. The press conference held to address the scandal drew even more attention than the original unveiling had. Cameras from every major outlet packed into a room expecting a corporate apology full of careful legal language and little substance. Grace gave them something different. She stood at the podium and told the full story without softening any part of it, including her own role in dismissing a warning that could have prevented the entire crisis from ever needing correction. She repeated, word for word, the exact phrase she had used on that tarmac weeks earlier, the promise she had made in front of engineers and reporters, when she was still certain that confidence was the same thing as being right. Every reporter in that room remembered the phrase instantly, because it had been captured on camera and replayed endlessly across news coverage of the failed launch. Grace stepped down from the podium, walked directly toward Aaron Brooks, who stood near the back of the room in the same simple clothes he always wore, and knelt down in front of him. She had brought a clean cloth with her, and in front of every camera in that room, she wiped down his work boots exactly as she had once mocked the idea of doing. She was not doing it because she had lost a bet made in anger. She was doing it because she had given her word, publicly and without qualification, and she intended to honor it regardless of how uncomfortable that honor might be. The room, silent for a moment out of sheer surprise, erupted into applause that lasted far longer than anyone expected from a gathering of journalists and industry analysts. Aaron simply smiled, the same quiet, unremarkable expression he wore through nearly every moment of the ordeal, and when Grace stood back up and asked if he had anything to say, he offered only a handful of words that would later be quoted in nearly every article written about that day. He told the room that the boots did not matter at all, that what mattered was the fact that no families would be receiving the kind of phone call that ends everything, the kind he had spent years of his life explaining to people after it was already too late to prevent. Grace Harrison spent the following year rebuilding Helix Dynamics into something fundamentally different from the company she had once run with unshakable confidence and very little humility. Under new leadership protocols she personally authored and pushed through the board, the company became recognized industry-wide as a leader in aviation safety standards, cited by regulators as a model for how manufacturers should handle internal quality concerns. She established a formal program called the Aviation Safety Trust, funded initially with a portion of her own executive compensation, designed to protect and reward employees at any level who raised safety concerns, regardless of their position or how inconvenient the timing might be. The policy she implemented was simple and absolute, stating that any employee from the newest hire to the most senior executive held the authority to halt a test or a launch the moment they identified a credible safety concern, and that no person raising such a concern in good faith could ever face retaliation or punishment for doing so. She had it written into the company's formal operating charter, not as a suggestion but as an enforceable rule that applied even to her own decisions as chief executive. Engineers who had once been afraid to question leadership began speaking up regularly, and more than a dozen genuine safety issues were caught and corrected in the following year alone before they ever became public failures. Aaron Brooks was offered the position of Vice President of Safety and Engineering, a role that would have made him one of the highest-paid executives in the company and given him significant influence over every future aircraft design. He declined the position exactly as he had declined similar offers years earlier, choosing instead to accept a role as an independent technical advisor, one that allowed him to move between projects without the weight of corporate politics attached to his name. He continued wearing the same simple clothes, continued eating lunch alone at the same picnic table near the hangar, and continued speaking only when he genuinely had something worth saying. Grace and Aaron developed, over that year, a working relationship built on something neither of them had experienced often in their professional lives, which was mutual and unforced respect. She consulted him on major engineering decisions not because his title required it, but because she had learned, in the most humbling way possible, exactly what his judgment was worth. He, in turn, found in her a version of leadership he had rarely encountered before, someone willing to publicly admit fault and rebuild rather than protect her own image at the expense of the truth. Neither of them ever spoke of the tarmac incident as an embarrassment. Both of them referred to it, when it came up at all, as the day everything that mattered finally became clear. New engineers hired that year were told the story during their very first week on the job, not as company legend but as a working example of exactly why the safety reporting policy existed in the first place. Some of them assumed the details had been exaggerated over time, the way most workplace stories tend to grow with retelling, until they met Aaron in person and realized the man behind the story looked exactly as unremarkable as everyone described him. He never brought it up himself, never used it to leverage more authority than his advisory title technically allowed him, and continued reviewing technical reports with the same quiet thoroughness he had always shown, regardless of whether anyone in the room remembered who he really was. 1 year to the day after the failed launch of Prototype 7, Grace Harrison stood on that same tarmac and watched a fully corrected, fully certified aircraft lift smoothly into a clear morning sky, its rotors steady, its systems reporting green across every panel. She thought back, standing there, to the laugh she had offered a quiet man in work boots, the laugh she had once believed reflected her own strength and certainty. This time, watching the machine rise without incident, she smiled again. But it was an entirely different smile than the one she had worn a year earlier. It did not come from confidence in her own superiority. It came from having finally learned, in the hardest way a person can learn anything, that reputation and title mean nothing beside competence, honesty, and the simple courage to tell the truth when everyone around you would rather you stayed quiet. And it was that lesson, more than any machine or any fortune, that would define the rest of her career, because a single person willing to speak the truth, even at the cost of public ridicule, had saved a company and had saved lives that would never even know how close they came to being lost.